Welcome to a new episode from the Sustainability Channel. I'm Thomas Stanley and I'm your host. And in today's news update, let's start by having a look at an article from Thomson Reuters and its 6 predictions for ESG in 2024, the year ESG emerged from fad to essential business. As ESG breaks through into the mainstream despite the challenges it faces, here are some predictions for 2024 on what we are likely to see in this area. On the first place, they're writing here that ESG gets fancy or financy. In 2024, sustainability will become deeply embedded in the financial foundations of companies. Already, nearly 1/3 of CFOs are examining the potential effects of climate change scenarios on financial outcomes in 2023, according to PwC. In addition, more organizations are creating ESG controller positions, a role that oversees and manages the integration of ESG issues into an organization's operations and financial reporting protocols. And on second place, ESG goes private. Sustainability reporting will expand to include private firms because of Scope 3 rules, which require reporting companies to monitor all indirect emissions that occur throughout the supply chain and among third-party vendors, particularly as the result of California and European Union regulations. Scope 3 requirements will drive significant transformations across all sectors, as every company in a field strives to meet the standards set by the largest players in their industry. And on third place, politicized environment around ESG will remain. Like throughout much of 2023, ESG will remain a partisan topic this coming year. Companies will need to remain cautious about how they discuss sustainability externally amid presidential and congressional elections and expectations for an increase in pro- and anti-ESG legislation in the United States. And of course, in the wake of 50 countries and regional bodies experiencing elections in 2024. And on fourth place, biodiversity will emerge as a mainstream ESG topic. While the topic of biodiversity loss was gaining steam last year, that trend continues. Indeed, nature and land use were included as a 2030 global deforestation goal at the Global Environmental Conference COP28 in December. In addition, investment funds that focus on biodiversity and nature are rapidly increasing in number and assets. On fifth place, supply chains at the center of the E and S in ESG. Several recent laws mandating Scope 3 reporting, including new laws in California and the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, combined with evolving expectations of stakeholders, are driving companies to prioritize ethical material sourcing, adherence to fair label standards, and initiatives aimed at reducing environmental damage across the entire supply chain. On sixth place, increased sophistication of greenwashing claims. Moving forward into 2024 and beyond, the notion of greenwashing, a term frequently employed to call out insufficient or misleading sustainability efforts and disclosures by corporations, is expected to be more clearly defined legally and carry weightier repercussions. Greenwashing carries with it reputational, regulatory, and litigation risks, and with no consistent legal definition, the concept of greenwashing will vary by product, service, regulator, and jurisdiction. The EU, meanwhile, is making considerable progress in eradicating greenwashing, encompassing the development of new rules designed to limit false advertising and to offer consumers enhanced information about products. So this was an interesting list from Thomson Reuters and an article from Forbes, Sustainable Technology, Examples, Benefits, and Challenges. Every company and every industry needs a green plan. These efforts are about lowering emissions, shrinking carbon footprints, and reducing the environmental impact of operations. But how can this actually be done? Sustainable technology is one of the key tools in those efforts. So what is sustainability? The concept of sustainability is intuitive when you consider the original meaning of the word, but is perhaps too often boiled down to lowering carbon footprint. Sustainability concerns practices that are sustainable, viable in the long term because they do not cause undue environmental damage. The inference here is, of course, that much of the way society operates at present is not sustainable. What is sustainable technology? Sustainable technology is that which can aid in improving the environmental impacts of societies, companies, and households. It can involve reducing the carbon footprint of tasks in which it is involved or be made using greener techniques. Sustainable technology examples. Look close at just about any industry and you'll find sustainable technology. It's used in homes, in manufacturing, in consumer tech, agriculture, fashion, and healthcare. In agriculture, sustainable technology is used to monitor the water level and health of crops in order to increase yield and optimize water usage. Drones can also be used to monitor crop health with cameras and machine learning-based vision AI. In architecture and house building, future-looking sustainable technology includes systems that harvest rainwater for use, as for example, toilet flushing liquid. Electrochromic glass, which darkens to respond to outside conditions, can drastically reduce the energy consumption of heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. In healthcare, electronic health records, EHRs, are used to obviate the need for paper documentation while also making the information far easier to transmit between healthcare providers. Telemedicine, remote appointments held over the phone or a webcam, naturally results in lower carbon emissions. Fashion also is an interesting industry. There are virtual try-on services, for instance, which can dramatically reduce returns and waste. And there are now also many more eco-friendly alternatives to polyester in the manufacturing of clothes. Polyester will eventually end up sitting in a landfill for decades as it's not biodegradable. Bamboo, hemp, tencel, and soy cashmere have all reached a level of development where they are perfectly suitable for use in clothing. In city infrastructure, sustainable technology is used in street lighting, along with the switch to LED lighting, also referred to as solid-state lighting, SSL, which consumes far less energy. And on city level, of course, charging of electrical vehicles, as well as increased use of electrified public transport vehicles, such as buses, are also an important development. So what are the benefits of sustainable technology? The surface benefit of sustainable technology is in reducing harmful environmental impacts, but this can also lead to better efficiency, lower costs, and reduced use of water in some cases. Sustainable technology can also make environments more pleasant places to be. And some of the challenges, sustainable technology often involves increased use of Internet of Things, IoT, sensors, and devices, which are ideal for optimizing efficiency in many areas, but those come with security challenges of their own. This tech also has its own energy footprint, meaning a practical and dispassionate approach is required to ensure the overall benefits are as compelling as they may initially appear. Similarly, sustainable technology can have an e-waste issue, particularly if it relies on IoT sensors with a limited functional life. And the future here, sustainable aviation fuel, for instance, SAF, is one of the more exciting avenues for further research and development. In November 2023, Virgin Atlantic flew a plane from London to New York powered by SAF. It is produced using cooking oils and recycled carbon and other waste products. The International Air Transport Association, IATA, suggests it can reduce aviation fuel carbon footprint by as much as 80%. And the bottom line, sustainable tech is a critical tool in green efforts at all scales. And the last article is from Nature. A giant fund for climate disasters will soon open. Who should be paid first is the question they are asking here. But first, in May 2022, unusually heavy rains swelled two rivers in north-central Bangladesh and triggered devastating flash floods. The deluge submerged farmers' fields, destroyed crops, and affected around 2 million people, a disaster compounded by gradually rising temperatures and erratic rainfall, which climate change had probably helped to drive. More was lost than livelihoods and crops. However, as researchers found when they asked villagers in the region how climate change had changed their lives, some Hindu women from low caste said they felt constantly anxious. These villagers are among the estimated 3.6 billion people globally who are highly vulnerable to climate disasters and who could, in the future, receive partial compensation from a vast new source of cash. In November 2023, at the 28th COP28 climate meeting in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, nations agreed to operate a loss and damage fund, kickstarted with donations of $661 million. Although many details of the fund are yet to be worked out, some were decided at COP28. Nations have proposed that the World Bank in Washington, D.C. could host the fund for the first 4 years under the supervision of an independent governing board, whose members should be nominated by the end of this month. Researchers welcome the fund, but many say it's insufficient and that important questions remain about how to allocate it. It's hard to work out which disasters can be attributed to climate change, who is the most vulnerable, and how to measure the losses they face. Some researchers worry that the fund will perpetuate the troubled history of development and climate finance, in which decisions made by elites in international and national governments and non-profit organizations have sometimes failed to address or have even compounded the losses experienced by people on the ground. The Loss and Damage Fund adds to existing forms of climate financing, such as the Green Climate Fund and Adaptation Fund, both of which are part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. These channel money from high-income countries to poorer ones for mitigation, curbing greenhouse gas emissions, and for adaptation to climate risks, such as protecting coasts. The board will decide on a system for allocating these funds, but according to guiding principles decided at COP28, developing countries that are parties to the UNFCCC would be eligible for payouts. The board might divvy up the money in several ways. It could, for example, decide a maximum amount that countries can receive, irrespective of how vulnerable they are, an approach used by the Adaptation Fund, which has set a ceiling of $20 million per country for projects, or it could prioritize on the basis of a nation's level of vulnerability, the approach used by the Green Climate Fund. The allocation system will be important, scientists say, because the fund is nowhere near meeting the scale of the need. The $661 million that rich nations contributed is a fraction of the $100 billion annually that low and middle income countries have requested by 2030. Another problem the board will have to consider is whether climate change helped to cause a damaging event. This field of climate science, known as extreme event attribution, has advanced quickly in the past few years, but is not yet ready for use by decision makers. So who gets the money? With a growing number of climate-linked disasters and a limited funding pot, the board will have to decide who is most deserving of payouts from the fund. One possible way is to use indices that attempt to measure a country's vulnerability to shocks. But some researchers have concerns about such indices. As of 2020, only 14 countries had a complete data set for all the indicators. For instance, small island nations had large data gaps, such as the island of Nauru, which is missing 33% of indicators. And what's more, vulnerability indices do not take into account historical conflict, colonial legacies, and race, gender, and other identities that can all contribute to disadvantage and a lack of resilience to shocks. And who decides? Another point of contention is who will make funding decisions. In 2020, about 73% of the climate finance provided by rich nations was in the form of loans, mostly from multilateral development banks such as the World Bank. Low and middle income countries have pushed for a different model for loss and damage funding. In committee meetings leading up to COP28, they asked for the money to be dispersed largely as grants and said it should also be directly accessible to national governments and local entities. And those countries also initially questioned plans for the World Bank to host the fund. The bank's president is elected by the United States, its largest shareholder, and it is viewed as disproportionately influenced by developed nations. A spokesperson for the World Bank says the bank is honored and committed to support countries in setting up the loss and damage fund as quickly as possible. Countries donating to the fund are making an important down payment on the promise of financial support to developing countries who are hardest hit by climate shocks. Lisa Schipper, a geographer who studied adaptation funding at the University of Bonn, Germany, is concerned that in reality, the Loss and Damage Fund will use existing development architecture and practices in which funding flows from elite institutions such as the World Bank, donor agencies, and national governments to recovery projects without consulting the people it's meant to support. So let's hope that will not come into fruition. That's all for today. Over and out, and live a sustainable life.